Welcome to This Week in Soccer on WorldSoccerTalk.com. My name is Carter Krishnaiyer. I'm joined today by Bobby McMahon, a familiar face to all football fans in North America, one of the great pundits from Fox Soccer and Rogers in Canada and other outlets, and Richard Farley of NBC Sports. Let's open the discussion up talking about the transfer window. What else will we talk about this week?
Nothing else. That's it.
Right. Yeah. Mass moves on the final day of the transfer window in England, but of course also deals that fell through, taking the headlines. Concerns about Manchester United in the post-David Gill, post-Sir Alex Ferguson era, among other things. Yes, among other things. Let's get your take first, Bobby. You've written an interesting article in Forbes this week about Spurs and Madrid in the wake of the Gareth Bale deal.
Yeah, I think what's interested me, guys, is over the last, and I guess it's the last few transfer windows, is what we see in the headlines. And the reality is what we see in the headlines isn't really indicative of the differences within each club and how they approach the transfer market. So you see headlines a la Real Madrid. Real Madrid spend $250 million. Tottenham spend $166 million. It's big numbers, but then you back off and you see that Real Madrid recovered part of that. Spurs recovered almost part of that. So it makes for good headlines, but it doesn't tell you how they actually approach the transfer market. Plus we've got, and this is the point I tried to make in the Forbes article this week, was when you get right down to it, we've got to differentiate between transfers in and transfers out because they're accounted for and the financial reporting on them is very, very different. So just the fact that Real Madrid go out and spend close to $250 million, doesn't necessarily, certainly doesn't mean that they've got to book that against their bottom line in 1 year. So, you know, this all sort of links into the financial fair play discussion and people's understanding of the financial fair play discussion and jumping on the bandwagon. Well, how can financial fair play be working if clubs are spending all this money? The reality of it is the transfer market and the dealings in the transfer market is so nuanced that these headlines are kind of blunt instruments we see now and again. But it's much more. There's much more to it than just the headlines. And then, until we dig into the details, we really don't understand what clubs are doing and whether some of the dealings they have make financial sense.
Bobby, what are your thoughts about the fact that Spurs' sale of Huddleston, Parker, Dempsey, Cocker, none of this seems to have been represented in the English press to a large extent, that they made some early sales of players that had been core players, I mean, particularly in the case of Huddleston and Parker, core players for them for a number of years now, and were able to buy against that for large portions of the window and then buy against Bale. I'm not even sure Spurs' net spending was a negative. They may have actually made money in this window.
Yeah, it's a slight negative. I think they're about maybe $5 million down or so. It's very little. But you know, I kind of go back to the sort of thought that I've seen this movie before, because I can remember when Tom Huddleston was a good buy. I can also remember when Scott Parker was a great buy, according to English media. So you know what we've seen is sort of 7 players out, 7 players in. And this is the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems I've had with this transfer window is the beification of Daniel Levy and Franco Baldini. The fact that we've been through this picture so often with Spurs. You go back to the beginning with Levy. How many managers has he turned over? How many turnovers have there been in the transfer market? And every time we hear this is the time, it's going to be different this time. And it hasn't. So I'm not saying that necessarily the Spurs dealings have been bad. I just think that perhaps the anointment of the success of this transfer window on Spurs and the structure they've used bringing Baldini in is perhaps a little bit premature.
Richard, your thoughts on that? Because Bobby makes a very good point. We've seen this when Martin Jol took over as manager and Daniel Levy was the owner. We saw this when Juan Di Ramos spent a lot of players in, a lot of players out in his couple windows, and then obviously Ari, well known for wheeling and dealing. This is nothing new for Spurs. So maybe is Baldini getting too much credit, and are we reading too much into what Spurs did?
I'm not necessarily sure that we're reading too much into it. I think the reason why the Levy and Baldini story is compelling is because of the contrast that it has with other clubs, where Levy does seem to, at least the narrative depicts him as somebody who is a little bit more shrewd, is somebody that is able to leverage the game a little better than other people to get those last few £1,000,000 in or out. But I do think that one of the things that Bobby mentioned was just the way that this whole thing is covered, and obviously how Levy is now depicted as some kind of prototypical or particularly shrewd chairman had something to do with that. I really wish that, particularly in this market, the U.S. market, and of course we have a lot of viewers and listeners who aren't in the U.S. market, I really wish we would look to how sports are covered in this market and really ask, what good qualities can we take from the coverage of stories happening here and apply that to the football world? Because one example is just our obsession with transfer fees over everything else. We know the numbers of Gareth Bale, but do people really know how much money Gareth Bale is going to make in salary? Because that's obviously a huge commitment also, and it really adds to the price tag. Now, the numbers that I saw really put Gareth Bale's salary at I think it was £150,000 per week, which is an exorbitant number, but it's not to the point of a Messi, Ronaldo,
or
Ibrahimovic number,
or even the John Terry.
So although the fee is exorbitant, you have to factor all of these things in when you're actually assessing the commitment the club is making. It's a 6-year deal. Bobby talked in his piece about the amortization. 6 years from now, if they're able to write off 1/6 of that transfer fee to 6 years from now, with the money that's being injected into the game, that figure is going to look a lot less than the 1/6 of that transfer figure that's on the books for next year when it actually hits the books.
Yeah, Bobby, your thoughts on that? Because obviously this is Real Madrid has done this before. They've done this sort of business. They've always come out on the other end. There's no real threat to them from financial fair play. We always hear speculation, but if you look at the numbers, they're fine.
I think Perez is a fascinating character because I think he's an incredibly astute businessman. He absolutely understands how to manipulate transfer markets, and he's certainly doing it from a position of power, the fact that he's the president of Real Madrid. But you look at the dynamic. I talked about this on Soccer Central last night in Canada. He got some early money. Higuain, Callahan, and Albiol went to Napoli, so he had some money there. So he knew he immediately had some money to deal with. So he knew he could approach Spurs at that point because they then had enough to sort of negotiate something, because if it had come down to a deal that involved money over a period of time, he had an upfront payment. He then did the Bale deal and then went out and sold Ozil to Arsenal. Now, they're still down on the deal because they've signed a couple other players as well. Mm-hmm. But it's all around cash flow. It's all around the turnover of stars, how he can turn stars into money, the deals that Real Madrid do with sponsorship, the expectations sponsors have of this continual star factory at Real Madrid. I think Ozil is a great example of it. Ozil is not, what is he, 24, 25?
Yeah, 24.
25? Most clubs would not be looking to sell these players, especially the top clubs at that age, because these players are coming into their prime. But the reality, as far as Real Madrid is concerned, these players have done their bit. They've been taken advantage of, perhaps, and that, I don't mean against their will, but certainly they've been, in terms of sponsors and the perception of them, they've run their time, and it's time to move on. And it's now time. It's Gareth Bale. Before it was Ronaldo. Before that, it was Zidane, it was Figo, it was the other Ronaldo, it was Roberto Carlos. You go through them all. The reality is that Real Madrid have got this down to an absolute T, and they're masters at it.
Bobby, what do you think about Spurs, though? Do they have the market down to an absolute T? And also, how does bringing Baldini in as a director of football to handle transfers, taking the manager out of the picture, how does that, one, help Spurs, and two, how does that create a buffer between Levy and his manager in a way that he didn't have with Redknapp, and we know there were clashes there?
Yeah, I'll mention one name, Comoli. He's been down this path before.
Right.
And then when Harry came in and said, I'm not going to work with Comoli, guess what happened to Comoli? Comoli was gone. So Levy is kind of, he's almost like the FA in terms of selecting English managers. He's bouncing back and forth from one pole to the other. So he's been down this road before. The Baldini thing, you look at it in the fact that he came in July, but he pretty much knew he had £85 million in his genes to go out and buy players. The biggest problem Spurs have got at the moment is integrating all these players. That's a massive turnover. Yeah. The buys, I think, generally are going to turn out to be pretty good. But it's going to be a bedding-in process. You just can't make these kind of changes and expect instant success. I think Spurs have done the best they can in the circumstances. But the reality is, I don't believe for 1 minute that Villas-Boas has been cut out from the process. It all comes down to there's got to be a process, there's got to be a strategy, but it's also only as good as the people you've got involved in the club as well. To say that suddenly Arsenal's way of doing business is not right because Arsene Wenger is the one man who sanctions transfers or not I don't believe that for 1 minute. That's like saying, well, Manchester United's model was wrong because Ferguson had the ability to do that as well. It worked out for Ferguson because of Ferguson. It's the people. It's not necessarily this approach that we have in the media that there is one right way of doing it. It's like saying there's one right set of tactics or there's one right formation. It makes for a good headline, but it's not reality.
Mm-hmm. Richard, what about that with Spurs? One thing I've noted is with Huddleston, Parker, those sorts of players going, Defoe kind of being on the fringes now, Lennon being out of the mix also, what you've got is a lot of new players bought from the continent, and young English players like Townsend, Walker, Danny Rose playing prominent roles. So you've got a young English core in a way, and then veteran foreign players from the foreign players that came from outside the Premier League. How do you think AVB makes that chemistry work?
I think he has a pretty proven track record, and it is eventually going to work. But as Bobby said, you can't expect to drop all these players in and have immediate success. And if you've watched Spurs' first 3 matches, you can see that that final third cohesion, the ability to read off each other is just not there. They're possessing the ball well. The basic organization is there. You can see what formation they want to play. They're able to defend, but they haven't scored an open play goal yet. They're not able to read the movements of Soldado. Christian Eriksen hasn't played at all. Eric Lamela just got a small bow in the last match, and these are a lot of players that are going to have to not only be dropped in, but learn how each other moves. Like Lamela is a player that you can pretty much kick the ball out wide right. He'll take on the left back, create something for you. Soldado isn't the type of player that's going to physically dominate anybody. Eriksen, I think he's actually going to have a steeper uptake than most people realize. How he's going to be able to pick out Chadley on the other side, or Lennon if he ends up playing Townsend. There's just a lot of they need to get to know each other, and I think that's interesting. And I think we're concentrating on Real Madrid and Spurs here. I think Real Madrid are going to have to go through a similar process because Carlo Ancelotti needs to decide how much he's actually going to play Karim Benzema. There have been rumors throughout the summer that Benzema might end up being dropped, although with Ozil going, that's a little less likely now. It's less likely that Angel Di Maria is going to be brought back in and make that kind of a 4-2-4-0 system that was rumored throughout the summer. Having Benzema there does allow for a focal point, but there's still going to have to be a lot of getting to know each other between Bale, Ronaldo, and Isco. All of those players are players that tend to play center left. So there isn't a lot of positional balance there, particularly with Marcelo coming up from the left back position. So it's going to be very compelling in that regard. Not to go on and on here, guys, but I'm just really confounded by the star-making ideas of Florentino Perez and how he's decided to sacrifice Mesut Ozil for Gareth Bale, particularly for the prices of those two players. When I think most people in the world would probably say that Mesut Ozil is probably the better all-around player of those two guys.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Bobby, your thoughts on that?
Richard, you took words out of my mouth there, because what you really get down to is Ancelotti has been told, that's the players you've got, you make it work. Perez hasn't put one consideration into this about the team and what it affects the team. All he's really focused on is, we need Bale, we need another star, here's the star, we're going to spend lots of money on him, we can make money out of this, throw him into the mix, Ancelotti makes something work. Ozil, no, but is there anybody in the world that believes Ozil is half the player Bale is? No, apart from Perez. it comes down to financial consideration. It's not coming down to the technical aspects of putting a team together. Like I just Ozil is one of the most gifted creative players that we've seen in the last 20 years. Players like him don't come along too often. And if anybody's got a steal in this transfer market, and I know the money's big, but the potential for Ozil at Arsenal with Arsenal style is enormous. I said last night on the show, he's the most potentially the most influential signing Arsenal's made of his type of player since Dennis Bergkamp arrived in '95.
Yeah, Amy Lawrence made a similar point on the Guardian website earlier today or late yesterday. Before we run from this transfer discussion, we need to talk about Manchester United in the post-David Gill, post-Sir Alex Ferguson era. Richard, you're laughing, so let me start with you. David Moyes has left it late in the transfer window before at Everton. Obviously, Kent Wright has very tight pockets. Finance always an issue at Everton. But this was a little surprising for Manchester United in spite of Moyes' track record.
Yeah, a little surprising. I think the contrast is what makes this so compelling for me, Kartik, because throughout the David Gill era, throughout the Alex Ferguson era, the one thing that you could be assured of was that Manchester United was a well-run club. They were a tightly run club. You might disagree with their individual decisions as to what they do, but generally when they decide to do something, they go and get it done. We talked about Daniel Levy over the last 10 minutes. Well, you remember the Dimitar Berbatov saga. They overpaid for Berbatov, but they got what they wanted. They snuck him out of White Hart Lane at the last minute and got his signature on paper. They were the people that frustrated Levy, although they had to pay a huge amount for it. Now you think about everything that has to go into planning and execution to get that deal to go down, and contrast that with what happened on Monday. Manchester United had one of the more memorable transfer windows, but for the wrong reasons. They go to Spain. You have one reports from the Telegraph saying Manchester United imposters showed up at the LFP office. Another report from the Guardian saying they were negotiating with imposter agents on the part of the player and athletic club. They have to pay more for Fellaini because their gambit to get Fellaini and Baines doesn't work out, which is a huge indictment of Moyes because he's the person that would be required to read that situation and tell Woodward that, you know, I know at the end of the day Ken Wright is going to have to take the money for these players. Well, he took the money, but for only one of the players that they wanted. And then you also talk about the Fabio Contrao situation where they had the ability to get a Portuguese international who's not. We hear the word international thrown around a lot. Fabio Contrao has the ability to be a world-class player. And they couldn't get him, even though Real Madrid wanted to see him out the door. So these are three major failings. It's the first transfer window for this management team, and it really does have to send some shivers up a Manchester United fan's spine that this transition period from a primacy of English football has introduced a lot of weaknesses into a previously impeccable club.
Bobby, your thoughts on that? David Gill, when he left with some fanfare, but not as much fanfare as perhaps he deserved, and that's now pretty obvious.
Well, you go back the years, Ferguson had some pretty pointed comments about the years of Peter Kenyon when he was at Manchester United and his failure to land Ronaldinho and make a couple of the other deals happen. Ferguson and Gill were two peas in a pod. They worked very, very well together. Reminds you sort of Ferguson's years with Dick Donald when he was a chair up in Aberdeen. You know, they worked very well together, and I think he did that with David Gill. Woodward's coming in. Woodward's coming into an environment that's completely foreign to him in terms of player transfer. And I just, as you're talking about it, Richard, I'm just thinking, isn't it interesting that on a day when so many questions asked about the Manchester United, that we're hearing the influence of Arsene Wenger's call to Ozil was the thing that tipped the move in Arsenal's favour, where sort of Wenger's been disparaged for the last few weeks about not getting the job done. I think what we're perhaps seeing in terms of Manchester United here is the players they're approaching are perhaps not completely either clear or confident that Manchester United and how they were running the Ferguson and Gill years are going to be run the same way. And perhaps it's a little bit of not a vote of no confidence in David Moyes and Ed Woodward, but a little bit of let's wait and see what happens at Manchester United before I decide to give my future to them.
Also, let me bring up PSG. Obviously, They went after Mesut Ozil at the last minute. They went after Juan Mata, who is having some sort of disagreement with Jose Mourinho. That may be down to Jose's, as I've written, Richard, as you know, Jose's narcissism, but that's a whole other issue. We'll get into that in a minute. Bobby, PSG, they've spent a lot of money, but in the end they didn't get necessarily the players they wanted, besides obviously Cavani earlier in the window.
I kind of get the feeling from a distance with PSG is they're now going into that mode that a number of clubs have gone through in the past. They've gone through that first surge of let's go and get good players. We've gone and got good players. We've put them on the park. Now, just a minute, it's not quite working the way we thought it'd work. It's not as perfect as we want. Now we're going to have to tinker with it. We need some more players. Maybe we need a Ozil. Maybe we need a Mata. Maybe we need... And now they're into that fine-tuning mode, and I think in many ways the fine-tuning mode is much more difficult than that initial acquisition where you go and spend $150 million or £150 million on going and getting some big-name players. That kind of jump from sort of middle to upper table is perhaps easier than the fine-tuning that's needed to make you a real powerhouse that's going to be effective in Europe. And I think maybe that's what they're seeing just now with going after the likes of... Ozil and Mata in the last 24 hours. They saw the opportunity. Maybe there was the ability to add players. Pastore perhaps not quite fitting the way they want him. Lavezzi is a little bit inconsistent. So maybe we're into kind of phase 2 of the PSG operation.
Well, Richard, I have some of the same views of Laurent Blanc as you do, and I think he did a fine job at Bordeaux. He won a league title at Bordeaux, but the limitations in that system, relying on set pieces, relying on Gourcuff, relying on Chamakh, were exposed the next season in the league. They weren't necessarily exposed to Champions League. They had a nice run in Europe, but I think that he wasn't the first choice of PSG, wasn't the third or fourth choice, and he's been given a short-term deal. I think he's almost in a no-win situation because if Monaco catches them or Marseille stays closer to them than they did last season, they were with them obviously for much of the year, ahead of them for much of the season until Ancelotti really cranked the team up. I think he's in a no-win situation, but tactically he's not the kind of manager you want if you want to go to that next level. His teams will be well organized, they'll be well drilled, but I think man management isn't a strength of his. We saw that even with the French national team. And I think he's got a real issue about selection. The selection was automatic at Bordeaux. It was more or less automatic with some exceptions with France. With PSG, it's certainly not. But let's actually, Bobby, let's get your real quick take on Laurent Blanc, and then we'll move on.
Well, I think the other thing that we've got to consider here is Leonardo is missing from last year as well.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of management. There's a layer of management that they've taken out. One of the things, and this kind of flips back to the whole Tottenham Hotspur and the Levy approach in terms of technical director. The whole theory of a technical director is really you give continuity. And we assume that because of that position you'll have continuity, but we saw it just in the last few months at West Brom when was it Dan Ashworth who's getting a lot of credit for the work he did bringing players into West Brom. Well, he's going to work for the FA now. So it's not just because you have these positions in place doesn't mean you necessarily have that continuity either. PSG perhaps suffering a little bit from that as well.
Okay, moving on. Before we get on to talking a little bit about the internationals, I wanted to, and talking about shirt sales also, let's me get your comments, both of you, on, I had earlier this week written an article about Jose Mourinho, and I think attributing his narcissism and his self-delusion, which I didn't want to believe. There was a lot of articles written when he came back to Chelsea about this isn't the same Premier League that Mourinho left, which we know it isn't. This isn't the same man, and he's now, his ego is so beyond recognition that he can't be as effective. I didn't buy into that, but after a couple of weeks of the season, seeing his handling of Mata, seeing his post-match press conferences, seeing his pre-match comments, his commentary towards Pep, I've kind of jumped on that bandwagon. Bobby, your take on Mourinho. Do you think he is in a self-delusional phase, as I've theorized, or do you think perhaps this is all gamesmanship and again Mourinho playing the press and playing games with his players?
Well, the one thing we're pretty much guaranteed over the years with Mourinho is we can never take him for granted, and we never quite know what's going to come out of his mouth. But the one thing that I felt right from the beginning of the part when we were dealing with and discussing Mourinho is nothing happens by accident with him. It's all well thought out, and it's all there to manipulate in one way or another, whether it's to manipulate players, whether it's to manipulate the media, the fans, and all the rest. He orchestrated the move back to Chelsea, and obviously Chelsea fans are absolutely ecstatic, given the welcome he had back at Stamford Bridge in terms of his second coming, if we can describe it as that, to Stamford Bridge. And so he knows the fans love him, and I think that's part of the process of to perhaps insulate himself a little bit with Abramovich, to believe that the Abramovich and Mourinho have kissed and made up and everything will be happy forever after is a little bit a stretch. Like, Mourinho cannot operate without rubbing somebody the wrong way, whether it's internally or whether it's externally. You go through all his time, whether it be at Porto, on to Chelsea the first time, into Milan, Inter at Milan, back to Real Madrid. There's always somebody getting rubbed the wrong way. So he will continue to do that, whether it's delusional, whether he believes his own press clippings. I guess we'll find out in time. But ultimately, I guess he'll be judged by whether he can turn Chelsea into Champions League champion again.
Right, exactly. And Richard, your thoughts on that? Bobby makes a point about the Champions League. I've talked to a few people in West London around Chelsea the last few days who say that Mourinho is he's got this relationship with the supporters that Bobby describes, but he's also got a degree of professional jealousy of Roberto Di Matteo, former Chelsea player, who won the Champions League. And I'm not sure if I buy into that theory, but perhaps there's something there.
Yeah, perhaps there is something there. I think we'll have to wait till it plays out a little bit. Particularly, we'll have to wait until Chelsea's actually in and started their Champions League run, see how Mourinho is interacting with the press and the other teams once you get into those knockout rounds and people can really zero in on the one-on-one matchups. That's when we usually see Mourinho's flair kind of kick in, because then he's able to talk about the opposition, talk about how they're playing, talk about the opposing boss's decisions. So I think we'll have to wait 5 or 6 months for that to happen. But I think what we are seeing is some curious decisions and some questions that I'm not sure Chelsea fans thought they were going to have to ask themselves this early. The Juan Mata thing can't be understated. He's been their best player for 2 years. And to see him left out of the team without any real good reason being provided, because they are still playing a system that he could fit in. If they were going to kind of a pure 4-3-3 without somebody playing behind a striker, you could see the logic for sacrificing Juan Mata, because he doesn't have a winger's dynamic. He can't really play deeper in central midfield, and he's not a striker. That's fine. But for the most part, they've been playing 4-2-3-1, and Juan Mata fits a lot of different places in that, particularly when you go in the Super Cup and don't play somebody that physically projects as a number 9. So that's absolutely baffling to me. And then letting Romelu Lukaku go out on loan again when you don't have a set number 9. You have two other options, Demba Ba and Fernando Torres, who you don't seem to have confidence in. You can have Romelu Lukaku there for 3 months trying to win that job, and then in January decide it's just not worth it. And you're going to be able to find a home for him, and he's going to be able to get his playing time before Brazil. These two decisions make me really, really doubt whether Jose Mourinho really has an open mind about the talent that he's inherited. It's been built with a different system in mind, but a good coach has to adapt what he does for the players that he has, and not adapting for Juan Mata to me is absolutely baffling, Kartik.
Yeah, that's really the basis of my analysis of Jose at this point, and moving Lukaku out on loan, good for the player. Not necessarily good for Chelsea, although we'll see. Samuel Eto'o, they've signed. A lot of people forget that, and he's got the established relationship with Jose. Yeah, he's got the established relationship with Jose, obviously, so that's a big part of it. Well, another topic related to the transfer window is how many of these transfers are based on shirt sales, marketing considerations, those sorts of issues. Florentino Perez in particular, known for buying based on that, and we consistently hear the criticisms from Ray Hudson here in the United States on BN Sports, formerly of Gold TV. Let me throw it over to you, Bobby. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's all rolled into one. Shirt sales, I think, in terms of sometimes are overrated in terms of, we see what we have to pay for a shirt, but the reality is that most clubs are getting a royalty payment of a percentage based on that, maybe 15, 20, 25% if they're really the big clubs. When you roll it around the world, it's good money, but it's not the be all and end all. I think it just rolls into.
Kartik, looks like we're having some technical issues with Bobby. He's just about to rejoin us, but I'd like to hear your views on this, Kartik. Like Bobby is saying, it's not like you're getting the full $100 every time a shirt is sold. There's a royalty payment to this. So how much should fans, Kartik, really be looking into this? How much of a factor should fans make this when they're evaluating whether a player like a Gareth Bale or a Cristiano Ronaldo potentially going back to Manchester United are returning to their favorite clubs?
Right, or even David Beckham for a couple months at PSG. That seemed to be based on selling shirts. But I think it's a real consideration, Richard. I think it's something that, particularly as Bobby's outlined, Florentino Perez plays the business angle of football as well as anyone, even though he's come in for a lot of criticism. When you look at him and what Madrid has done, in spite of the criticisms of Ray Hudson and others, yes, they flipped these players. And Hudson's famous tweet last night, and he said it on air also on BN, was, "Oh, well, this is a president who chose David Beckham over Ronaldinho." Yes, but it also helped the financial health of the club and certainly increased the profile of Real Madrid globally at a time when the football business was exploding in new frontiers, North America, Asia, and Africa, and put Real Madrid in a catbird seat, if you will, with regards to football business. So I think in reality, it's something that you almost have to consider. I think Arsenal, Ozil is a great buy for all the reasons Bobby outlined, and I agree. He's one of the best creative midfielders we've seen in world football in the last decade. But he's also a guy. And this is also not just an Arsenal issue. This is a Premier League issue. Premier League has lost a lot of marquee players in recent years. Now, for the first time in a while, you see a Premier League club going into Spain, going to Real Madrid and taking one of their marquee players, and a guy that you can market similarly in Ozil.
And he's going to be raising awareness in the English language for the importance of umlauts. We're already seeing that. Bobby, how much money are we really talking about here? From the figures that I see, we're talking about in the low millions per year if you're talking about a star player, like somebody who's going to be in the top 15 or 20 kits sold. How much money are we talking about here, and how much do you really think clubs should be considering that? Because we know Perez is considering it, but how much should he be considering it?
Well, I think what you've got to do is you really, when you think about it, it kind of breaks down into a number of different kind of segments, because you've got the pure shirt sale. So you've got the rights to sell the shirt. So the Adidas, the Puma, the Nike of the world looking to sell the shirt for you. But the second piece you've got on is who do you put on the front of that shirt to go with the Nikes and the Pumas, etc., etc. And the whole thing basically wraps up into then the wider kind of prospect of overall sponsorship. And what you come down to is the need, and this is back to kind of Perez. Perez perhaps takes it to a degree that he does take it to a degree that affects the technical aspects of the team. But what he shows other teams is you've got to continue to be some sort of star factory. You've got to produce talent. You've got to be seen at the forefront of producing talent, because that's going to encourage more fans. You look at the increase in Chelsea fans around the world over the last 10 years. Now, that's down to one thing, the fact that Chelsea were successful. They had a charismatic manager in Mourinho when just after the year after Abramovich took over. They made household names of Lampard and Terry, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. Yes. But they went out to buy Torres, Shevchenko, two players that didn't particularly work out. Certainly Shevchenko didn't work out, and Torres still hasn't worked out. But they're still front and centre as far as the public are concerned, and they're still giving their fans the belief that they were buying really good players. So this whole branding of, it's a phrase I hate, but it's the reality, is the branding of clubs is very important, and it rolls into this bigger kind of this real global aspect of how you sell sponsors. Manchester United, just to move off the Real Madrid thing for a little while, Manchester United have shown some very interesting strategy around segmenting the world and selling sponsorships on a regional basis as well as a global basis as well. So they've shown that you can actually take the potato chip category and turn that into 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 different market segments around the world and make a lot more money from it. That's going to be the challenge for other clubs as they go down the road here. How can they fully exploit their brand value in terms of sponsorship? So it goes well beyond just the shirts. It goes into everything that really affects the club. And maybe, to bring it back to the Ozil thing, maybe that's one of the key parts of marketing Mesut Ozil to Arsenal fans and fans around the world, that Ozil is a kind of Arsenal player. Like, they've gone out and he kind of fits the Arsenal brand. They're not trying to re-educate, and they're not going out to get a player that you go, why did they sign him? Which you may ask if you're a Manchester United fan with the likes of Fellaini. He's a player I think will be very effective, but he doesn't exactly hit the Manchester United brand, I don't think.
No, I can't remember the last time Manchester United had a player like Fellaini. You brought up Chelsea. You talked a lot about Chelsea. It's such an interesting example because the rise has been so prodigious, and it's been in our lifetime over the last couple of decades. Kartik, as Chelsea aggressively markets themselves to the United States and Asia, one of the things that really stands out to the fans is Chelsea is the worst offender when it comes to producing a ridiculous number of kits each year. They are the absolute worst. It seems like almost every other match they have a different kit: black, blue, yellow, different
fluorescent
fonts, everything.
pink.
Yeah. So at some point,
is this where we mentioned John Terry and kit?
I'm going to steer clear of that one, Bobby, but I'm going to throw it back to you in a few minutes. So, Kartik, at some point, this does seem a little bit scammy, particularly when it comes to the kits or the special engagements where the clubs that fans have to buy into. The kits are what I want to concentrate on. At some point, it just seems a little bit ludicrous. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, in fact, it's funny you mentioned Chelsea and the kits, because we were having this conversation this weekend with a few people about Chelsea's third kit always being a scam, always being something new and different that every Chelsea supporter feels like they have to own. A lot of working class supporters in West London buying those third kits, buying the second kit, which is generally a different color each season. Adidas has made Chelsea their poster child in football, besides the German national team and Bayern. Chelsea is the other big Adidas brand. And Adidas and Chelsea have both leveraged that brand, not only in the UK and in Europe, but in North America and Asia. And if, for example, when I've traveled to visit family in India, you see an Adidas ad, it's got JT on it, or it has, well, it had Michael Essien, he's back with Chelsea now, but it had Michael Essien, Drogba, JT, and it would be an Adidas ad, but it was very subtle, subliminal messaging that Chelsea is an extension of the Adidas brand. And we've seen that with Manchester United and some of the teams they work with, and I've heard lots of complaints from United supporters and Arsenal supporters about the alternate kits that Nike have marketed for those clubs. And now Manchester City has switched to Nike this season, and as a City supporter, a longtime City supporter who's used to getting my one Le Coq Sportif kit, and it was good for a couple of years, for 3 seasons. Now Umbro started the trend of changing the kit every season. We're Nike owned, and now Nike has radically done something with the kit, and you feel like you're left out if you don't have it.
Bobby, I want to talk to you a little bit about sustainability. Over the last, for quite some time, we have seen just tons of money being injected into this game, particularly as television contracts have become more lucrative and new markets are being exploited. New fans are coming into the game. A lot of times more white-collar fans who are able to spend money on a fourth kit for a team. But I wanted to talk to you about whether you see this as sustainable. A lot of teams are incorporating this into their actual business models, but 10 years from now, we're going to continue to see the growth of this revenue stream that we've seen over the last 10 years.
If you'd asked me that, Richard, 5 years ago, I think I would have been giving you the we're all going to hell in a handcart talk. And, I've come round to the belief that this is going to continue. I think we'll look back in a few years' time and think this was only the beginning, because I think it's really so much of it's driven by technology. And the fact that we do have, I've said this to a number of people, I go back to the 60s, and I remember when watching the 66 World Cup as a kid, you thought it was the world game. It wasn't the world game, it was the South American and European game. And the FIFA have come in for a lot of criticism, but the one thing that Avalanche did do that was good and honest to some extent was he realised that they couldn't take the game for granted, and we couldn't take the game and call it a world game if it wasn't being fully embraced by the likes of Africa, Asia, and to some extent even North America. Sorry, cat's making an appearance there. And so I think the laying out of the underage age group tournaments around the world and really opening up the World Cup to all the world was very important. I think the clubs have now taken advantage of that. That, when you combine it with the technology and television in particular. Now, where we go with television, I think that's the next big question. Are we going to continue with the model of a really conventional broadcast model, which is in the States NBC, in Britain it's Sky and BT and all the rest, or how close are we to actually, and I remember reading this almost 40 years ago in a Sports Illustrated feature they did on the future of sport, and it was very much North America, and they used basketball as an example at that time. And what they suggested, and they've absolutely been spot on, that was going to be television revenues was going to be the future of sport, and that was going to drive sport to a completely different level. Now you wonder if maybe conventional broadcasting is beginning to come to an end, and we're going to be in a model where we're actually going to be paying fans on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night or whatever, and we're just going to have to pay money similar to somebody in the stands to watch our teams, because that's the next great revenue stream, the ability for a Manchester United fan to watch his team whenever he wants, but it's going to cost him a lot more money than it does just now.
Yeah, that's a great kind of canary in the coal mine to look for. We can kind of see that coming, but once the bird tips over, we know that it's here. We see teams, I believe it's Benfica in Portugal, that have exclusively bought their own television rights. So rather than a conventional distribution model where you might see an NBC Sports buy up a league's rights, well, Benfica owns the rights to their games. I want to go Bobby and Kartik at the end of this segment, because it seems like with so many things we talk about in this show, we have to assess whether it's good or bad. It's always weird to look at things on that level, because in a certain philosophical way there's no good or bad. But Bobby, do you feel better, or do you feel good about the way the sport is going? Do you see the future in this regard, the commercial realm, as being viable?
I just see that it's as long as you're attracting eyeballs to television sets, and as long as you're attracting bums in the seats, you've got a model that sponsors are going to be attracted to, and on a global basis. So you've got other sports that will continue to try and catch soccer, football around the world. They're all playing catch up, whether it be NFL, NBA. They're all behind the eight ball. They're all trying to catch up with soccer. And the reality is there is now so much money in the game, and there will continue to be vast amounts of money in the game, that it's going to continue to drive the quality. And as far as quality is concerned, it's pretty hard to argue that the quality has somehow declined over the years. The game is quicker. The quality of some of the players, to me, I just continue to be in awe of the ability that I can watch every weekend. Yeah, we get some bad games now and again. We have to suffer through some stuff, but if you watch the quality of the play we see week in, week out, it's just getting better and better. And so from that perspective, I think we've got to say that the game, for all its warts and boils, is still pretty healthy, and it's still something that fascinates us and is going to continue to attract more and more people to it, I think.
Kartik, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Bobby. I think anytime you're attracting investment, you're attracting high-level sponsors, it's good for football. Ultimately, there is a romantic side that we see often reflected in David Kahn's pieces in The Guardian, and the loss of innocence, if you want to call it, community-owned clubs, and the difficulties clubs in the Football League are having in England. Adapting to this new world order, if you will, in football is certainly a difficult one. But at the same time, ultimately, you have to look at, even though we have sentiments involved, is the generate evolution of things good for the sport, good for the marketability of the sport, good for the sustainability of the sport? And I have to answer, yes, it is.
I completely agree with both of you. There's never been a better time to be a soccer player, a soccer fan, a soccer professional, and by those standards, it's very difficult to say that we should go back to any other point in time or imagine a different course to take forward. Gentlemen, we have one other topic that we're going to hit here in the last segment of our show. As of now, we are in an international break, which means for most of the people listening, their favorite players are now playing for teams they don't care about. But Kartik, I'll ask you to introduce this tension, because there is a tension between the responsibilities these contracted players have to their clubs and the soccer world that says that international football has a definite place in this game. And that tension generally comes down to playing time, usage, potential injury concerns. Kartik, explain how you see the current landscape of that tension and how you think an ideal world would look.
And Richard, we deal with that tension during every international break, because there's a segment of supporters and fans who are entitled to their beliefs that international football is more important than club football, even though the club teams are, of course, paying these exorbitant salaries and exorbitant fees to acquire the services of the players. And as a fan of a club that's now a major club, it wasn't a major club when I began supporting them, Manchester City. I mean, I see guys like Edin Dzeko play 90 minutes for Bosnia in a friendly 3 days before our season opener, or 4 days before our season opener. Bosnia played the U.S. Last month, and say, I'm surprised Pellegrini didn't send instructions to the Bosnian manager to only play him 45 minutes, or perhaps he did. And that was defied. I think that's an inherent tension, because you have a lot of people, let's take, Richard, where you and I are in the United States, you have a lot of people who feel like they need to see these players play together, play often, play 90 minutes. And even in breaks, or so-called breaks, thank God FIFA's getting rid of this August date, but midweek games, or even friendlies that are in a 2-week break but are on that Tuesday before club football comes back the Saturday, and they have to take the transatlantic flight back to Europe. And this is an inherent tension that continues. I personally think FIFA has to figure out a better way to manage this, and that's why, Richard, in a previous show, when we talked about Qatar and the Winter World Cup, I said, gosh, I don't want to see that happen, but at the same time, anything that will make the level of international football better and more compelling, I'm for, because right now, to me, the international sport, besides waving the flag and the pageantry of the World Cup itself, is not compelling when you compare it to the UEFA Champions League. It's not compelling when you compare it to the Premier League or the Bundesliga or La Liga. It's just not. It's just not at the same level. Bayern Munich is infinitely better than any international football team, including Germany's team, which has a lot of Bayern players at this point in time, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Bobby, let's dive into that a little bit, because I think most of the people that you and I and Kartik talk to would agree with that point, but it's not exactly a message that's been put out there a lot, and it's not exactly a message that I think a lot of fans, particularly here in this part of the world where the primacy of the U.S. and Mexican and Canadian national teams still very much exists in the fans' hearts. It does seem like international football, when you watch it, is just on a different, lower level.
Yeah, but I think to pick up on what Kartik said there, and I absolutely agree. I think the real fan knows that if you want to watch the best competition in the world, you're going to watch the Champions League. But having said that, the World Cup attracts more eyeballs than any other competition in the world. And how many new fans over the years have been attracted to the game because of the World Cup? Because the World Cup touches some very basic needs within us as sports fans, or just human beings, the need to identify with our country, identify perhaps with some players that we know or have watched as they grow up, or watched as youngsters, or come from our town or city, our neighbourhood, etc., etc. So I don't think you can separate the two. I think you've got to realise there is definitely a place for the World Cup, because it attracts immense attention to the games. It doesn't, it doesn't matter about the quality of the game. Because you take the World Cup final and you put a crappy game on, apart from Brazil and Italy in 1994, which was really, really bad, but generally the game will throw up points of controversy, it'll throw up points that engage us. because I think really what you get down to is the great thing about the game is it can be enjoyed on so many levels. As long as you've got two teams that are fairly equal matched, and sometimes not even equally matched, but they can put on a spectacle. So it's not necessarily about the technical quality of the game, it's really about the spectacle. So there is a place for the World Cup, and I think the clubs have to understand it. And the clubs, I think, are a little bit two-faced about this as well, because we realise that, you know, as much as the clubs complain about their players going off and playing international football, what we really saw was the bottom line was they were complaining about their players going off and playing international football and them not getting reimbursed for it. And we saw some money going to the clubs in the last, and that's going to be another revenue stream that they see that they're going to further exploit as the World Cup continues to be this bigger and bigger cash cow. So I think, you know, the clubs are a little bit two-faced and speak out both sides of their mouth as far as that's concerned. I think when you get right down to it and you cut through, and your point about Mexico and the United States, I think is a very good one, because you have got that real pride, and there is a real importance to the success of the US national team and to the Mexican national team as well in this area, as you see in South America as well. I think you've actually got I think the problem area is Europe, and I think the problem area is Europe is they've got a very unwieldy qualification system both for the World Cup and European Championships. I don't think many people complain about the World Cup. I don't think many fans complain about the European Championships. I think the real bugbear is the qualification process for these two tournaments and why you've got so many games that really are quite meaningless.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, Kartik, people have said for a long time that Europe should really be dividing their confederation off in some way. We see confederations the size of the Asian and the North, South, Central American Confederation actually segment off their qualifying processes, so the top teams are playing less games. The counter argument you hear is that, you know, nations like Moldova and Liechtenstein, they want that home game against England every once in a while. They want that home game against Germany, even if in a place like Albania it's only drawing 4 digits worth of people. Kartik, what do you think do you think that UEFA should somehow be compelled? Do you think is there a way for UEFA to be compelled to change things up? Or not? It's not just UEFA. Obviously, for the World Cup, it's a FIFA process. Do you think the clubs have enough power to actually draw a line in the sand at some point?
They've threatened to, but I don't know that they have the overall power. Bobby's right, the immense marketing power of the World Cup, and I agree with him completely. There are more eyeballs on that than any other event in sports, including the Olympics, so including the Summer Olympics. So you're talking about the biggest event in sport, and millions of casual fans who, even though we're saying the UEFA Champions League much higher level than the World Cup, millions of people who will never watch the UEFA Champions League final and don't even know what it is. Watch the World Cup. So it is important for sport. It's important for football and the business of football that continues to be done right. But my concern is, and I think Bobby's hit on it, is about the qualifiers. I think that's the thing that creates this problem. This gridlock, this fixture congestion. It's a tough problem because Platini has argued very articulately that it's important for Liechtenstein, Andorra, San Marino, the Minnows to have the opportunity to play Italy or play Germany or play England and to aspire to that. And obviously CONCACAF, the Asian Confederation, Africa. Now Africa has a very complicated qualifying process now, a very difficult qualifying process. They're probably not going to send their best 6 teams to the World Cup because of it. No. But they have all figured out a way to make this a little more efficient than Europe. And again, most of the top footballers in the world are Europeans. I mean, obviously, South America, CONMEBOL second. CONMEBOL also has a very difficult and long, arduous qualifying process. So actually, the two confederations that are the problem confederations are the two best confederations, the UEFA and CONMEBOL. And I'm not sure the CONMEBOL qualifying process has to be 3 years in length, which it basically is, or 2.5 years in length, with each team playing each other twice. So that.
But remember, Captain, you don't have Copa America qualifying that you have in European Championship.
Right. That's
so there's a difference there. So I think when you add up the two, Europe is a much more heavily weighted kind of qualification when you've got the two tournaments, as opposed to the South American model, which is really taking the equivalent 2 and spreading it over 3 years. So.
Right. No, that's a very good point, Bobby, because you actually have a year off from qualifying completely in South America. You don't have. Think about this. After World Cup 2014, we'll be right back
into it.
Yep. European Championship qualifiers in September. That's the way every cycle's been. So That's ultimately the problem. I don't have an answer. I'd like UEFA to change it, but I understand Platini's argument.
Bobby, I want to go back to the idea of spectacle that you talked about and how the spectacle of the World Cup is really something that not only draws more people, but they're drawing in the casual fans who are then a small percentage of them going to take the next step to watch, be it Champions League, the Premier League, Major League Soccer. It's a very important thing in all mediums that you have something that can reach beyond your established realms. But Bobby, I want to draw the parallel with the Olympics, which is another quadrennial event, to where the names don't really matter who are in the Olympics. Ultimately, we have the stories told for us before the torch is lit or run into the stadium, and we know who the key players are going to be. So when we're talking about taking people away from their club responsibilities and throwing them into the international realm, could it be argued that the particular names that participate in the World Cup don't matter? That the biggest names don't have to be there for the casual fans to be drawn in and the spectacle to be maintained?
Yeah, maybe once they're there, but I wouldn't underestimate, the names Messi and Ronaldo are worldwide brands, as Beckham was as well. I think that's all part of the magnet. I think it gives a perception that if you're tuning into something and Messi is playing, then you're watching the best player in the world or one of the best players in the world. So it's all part of that kind of pulling them in. It's like the Olympics. Well, people sit down and watch artistic gymnastics. No bugger all about artistic gymnastics, but they've got a pretty good view, or they're viewing with some confidence that they're watching the best artistic gymnastics people in the world. So they're watching the best, so that's good enough for them. So it's all interconnected, it's all tied together, and ultimately it's a production line. You're stuffing potential fans in the front end. They watch a World Cup. A lot of them will disappear, or not. A lot of them will never watch for another 4 years. Some of them will become casual fans. Some of them will become fully committed fans, and some of them, like us, will become fanatics. But you don't get everybody. But you've got to have that method of attracting them on a regular basis, because a World Cup fan will become a European Championship fan, will become a Champions League fan, will become a Gold Cup fan, an MLS fan. They'll all find their little segment, and even if they're just a casual fan every 4 years, FIFA can turn that casual fan into money, and that money goes into the game or FIFA's pocket.
That's so important because I think we saw after the '98 World Cup, less so 2002, even though the U.S. did real well. I think the time of the World Cup meant less because of Japan, Korea, less people watching. But after '98, 2006, and 2010, we saw an influx of new fans looking for other mediums to channel this new fandom, and most of them gravitate towards Major League Soccer or their local team, if it's NASL, USL, whatever, or more so than English Premier League. And we saw Fox take advantage of that after the '98 World Cup, launching a 2-hour show that was on every Sunday on Fox regional affiliates. 2006, increasing their scope of coverage with the Premier League and giving us a show Bobby was on every night. Yep. From Winnipeg, and then 2010 doing the same, and NBC has similar plans after the 2014 World Cup, after talking to them this weekend.
Kartik, at the high elite end of the scale, clubs have a lot of power. As you start to go down, national teams start to find a balance. Regardless, there is a system in place, and there's always been power shifts within that system. But it has been a balance between clubs and national teams, the international game. What responsibility do clubs, as they become more powerful, have to maintaining that system? Do they have any responsibility?
They do. Now, whether they'll exercise that responsibility is a whole other issue. That's, you'd have to ask Uli Holness or Rummenigge in Bayern, those sorts of clubs, or the chief executive. It's not Peter Kenyon anymore, but guys like that, guys like David Gill, Woodward now at Manchester United, do they feel they have that responsibility? I believe as a fan they do, but do the clubs feel like they have that responsibility? That's a whole other issue. I don't think they do, personally. I mean, Bobby, what do you think?
I think what it is I don't think you get a straight answer for the clubs, because I think if you looked at it from a business model and a strategy model, or a strategy perspective, the clubs realise that they can take advantage of international play, because international play potentially round something like a World Cup or European Championship put their players on view, and if their players come back from a World Cup, suddenly moving from being a very good player to a world star, let's face it, they're going to make money from it. It's in their best interests. So I don't think you're necessarily going to get an honest answer from a football club executive about how international football fits in. They see it as a constant battle and a constant negotiation with FIFA and UEFA, in some cases with Platini, to get the best deal possible. So they're not going to allow people to believe that they feel they have something they can benefit from through international soccer, or they've got some responsibility. But the whole thing is, the day that bond, even if it's a loose bond, is broken, is the day we finish up with a sport that really isn't a global sport, but then becomes just a series of fiefdoms. For all the criticism FIFA have and take, and my goodness, they deserve a lot of it, the one thing they still do is they have a cohesive worldwide governance model, as faulty as it may be, but it encompasses the globe, which is something that few other sports, if any, can actually boast of. And that's been the basis of expansion and the revenue generation that soccer has seen, has gone through in the last 20 years. So the clubs do benefit and have benefited from that worldwide aspect.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Bobby, because in a lot of ways you could see the difference between soccer and basketball are only the things that you talked about, because basketball is an incredibly popular sport, but there is no club in the basketball realm that could ever compare to the biggest clubs in soccer, but a lot of that is because of the international presence of soccer and the cohesion that you just talked about. Well, gentlemen, we're now in that point of the show where we need to say goodbye, but I want to give each of you a chance to do so. Tell everybody what you have coming up. Kartik, this isn't the only show you do for World Soccer Talk. What do you have coming up on Voices of Soccer?
Voices of Soccer, we're going to look at the trip that the gaffer, Christopher Harris, and I took to Stamford, Connecticut this past weekend to spend some time with NBC, with Robbie Earl, with Kyle Martino and Rebecca Lowe as they were on the set, and watch how they mix games and how they bring their feeds in, and some of the things behind the scenes that you haven't seen yet. And we did something similar, or the gaffer did, with Fox many years ago, and it'll be real interesting for our viewers and for people who are enjoying the coverage from NBC of the Premier League at this early stage in their 3-year contract that cover the league.
Yeah, not to seem biased or anything, but there is something about NBC in particular, and the way they go about things. When they decide to do something, well, there's a reason why the Olympics are so popular.
And that's important, Richard. I think the thing you're going to see in this video that differentiates NBC from Fox, again, not taking a shot at Fox, is the commitment level to soccer as a sport that may have been there at Fox at one point, but as management changed and priorities changed, wasn't there towards the end.
Well, Bobby, you have some different addresses, but you still have multiple streams that you're coming at us through, be it visual or in the written word. Why don't you tell everybody where they can regularly find your work?
Well, if you, I guess the written word's at Forbes.com is probably the best place. That's at least a weekly column I've been doing since, well, probably the last 24 months. So that gets banged out on a regular basis. And then Soccer Central in Canada. And unfortunately, Sportsnet are kind enough to put the video up now and again from them, usually on Monday night appearance, sometimes a Thursday as well. It's just, we're going through a bit of a retooling at the moment in terms of the show after Fox Soccer Daily split and went their own way in the States. So that, and continue to get radio requests, so doing a little bit of radio this afternoon. Radio is still my great love. I like television, but radio is still my favourite, so I enjoy doing radio as many times as I possibly can.
Well, particularly Soccer Central, if people do take some time to tune into that, they'll see a couple of other familiar faces on there, too. Well, everybody, thank you very much for tuning in to another edition of This Week in Soccer. Of course, you can always get this show through World Soccer Talk, as well as through its YouTube feed, where it's posted in the middle of each week. But until next week, for Bobby McMahon, Kartik Krishnaiyer, and the absent Lawrence McKenna, I'm Richard Farley, thanking you again for joining us for the show.